Now the pleasure of introducing another Jason, that's former Congressman Jason Chaffetz, whom you now see on Fox News, who was a 5-term congressman from Utah. And if you follow the news, as I know you do, you know that he was instrumental in sparking investigations into the U.S. Secret Service, the Drug Enforcement Authority, and the Environmental Protection Agency, among many other government agencies. He's a real stalwart in the conservative movement. He, like so many of us in this room, if not all of us, tries to be very cheerful in articulating a message, even when it's a little bit of a difficult one. And I think that what you will see, as you saw from our colleague, Jason Isaac, that this Jason, Congressman Chaffetz, is going to be able to do that for us, analyzing what's going on in 2020 and beyond. One important fact you may forget about the former congressman is that he was an award-winning place kicker for BYU. And he's, I think, going to nail the uprights with the speech that he has for us today. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Chaffetz.
Well, thank you. They just told me to make sure and just be shorter than Adam Schiff, and you should be just fine. And I think I can do that. Thanks for having me. I got to tell you, I was honored, privileged to serve in the United States Congress. But I got to tell you, I have found the key to happiness, and part of that key of happiness is leaving Congress. But it's something I share with every audience, because it's something that once you see it and do it, you want to share with everybody because you want them to be as happy as you are. And so what you got to do is, when you wake up in the morning and your hair's all disheveled, you're rolling out of bed and you're not quite sure how things are going to go, just do this and you will be happy. Just go up in front of that mirror in your bathroom, look in the mirror, and then just say, "I'm so happy Hillary Clinton is not the President of the United States." And I know we got some Democrats here, but please, believe me, you'll be happy as well. I'm very fortunate to be here. I got a very good introduction there. I was a place kicker, which is far different than being a football player, because, if you're a football player, as a place kicker, if they touch you, they throw a flag. So thanks for the nice introduction. I always have a good warm reception in Texas. I wish I was with my wife. We're just about to become empty nesters, and it's a hard time in transition. I've been very blessed. My wife and I will celebrate our 29th wedding anniversary in February. We've been blessed with 3 children. Our oldest son and then our daughter are both married. Now, being from Utah, I want to clarify, they're not married to each other, okay? So, and then our youngest daughter just turned 19, and it's hard to look at that whole transition in life and recognize that life's changing. I look back in those times, they just fly by so much. They fly by so fast. And I look back at the career and look back at the time, and the message that I kind of want to share with you is this whole idea and this whole thought process of, how are we going to leave our future to our kids? Now, to those of you that I already offended because you're Democrats here, I don't believe that all the solutions are wrapped up in one party or another. I really, in my heart of hearts, believe that we need good, thoughtful, honest-minded people that can come to the table and work earnestly to make our country great as best we possibly can. And that not all of those reside on one side. But I think sometimes, too, as we kind of move forward in this whole discussion and this whole thought and this whole process, that Twitter and Facebook serve a purpose. I'm all about duking it out on Facebook and Twitter. But sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes we talk past each other. We're yelling and screaming at 130 characters or 140 characters at a time, but I don't know that we're necessarily being as persuasive as we possibly can. The challenge that I have for you that I've been sharing across the country is, this question of, why do you believe what you believe? And challenge you to, as we make the arguments about certain public policy, the way you see it, that we take time to not just berate people and knock them over the head with a stat or, look at this stat, look at this number, but that we actually explain to people why we believe what we believe. If we want to actually convert people, if we actually want to make our arguments stick, then we have to go another step in explaining why we believe what we believe. And that's going to come through your background, right? That's going to come through your history. That's your own personal history, your own personal motivation. I look at mine. I grew up in a very fortunate, blessed household. I was talking to Chuck DeVore earlier. He knew my dad, who passed away just a few years ago. But I grew up in Northern California, Southern California, Arizona, Colorado. I kind of bounced around a little bit, but for me, that's how we grew up. It was an idyllic household. It was a household that was filled with joy and happiness. I never wondered for a moment growing up where I was going to get my next meal. I never worried if I'd have shelter over my head. I never saw my parents argue. Never. I can't give you one circumstance where they argued. And that's not the way everybody grows up. I understand that. We were prosperous. We lived in a nice household. I make no apologies for that. But as I got older, life changed. Life changed for us. I remember my younger brother and I, in the morning, my parents were both there, and they were a little more dressed up than they normally were for breakfast. And we sat there, and my parents told me that they were going to get divorced. And that was hard. When you're a young teenager and your parents come to you and say that they're going to get divorced, you don't really have the capability or the experience to understand what that means and what the implications are. I also remember my parents saying they loved me and that they cared for me. It had nothing to do with us. But I don't know that I necessarily believed that till I got older. Fast forward a few years, one of the hardest, most difficult things that happened to me was when my mom told us that she had breast cancer. I didn't know what that meant. I mean, I'd heard of cancer, but I didn't really internalize what that journey was going to mean. And it took me places that I didn't want to go. I never chose to do that. My mom didn't choose to do that, but here we went. And we had the best of times, the closest of times, the hardest of things. Most difficult parts of my life growing up were watching my mom go through that. I'm also convinced in retrospect that those times, as difficult as they were, made me closer to my mother. She passed away at an age that's younger than I am. And I still can't believe that. I still have days where I wake up and something good happens or something bad happens, and I think I need to call her. Just for that split second. Later on, my dad would also get cancer. And he fought it for about 1.5 years before it took his life. I tell you those stories because if you were looking at my life and you're looking at the nice homes we're in and that I was playing soccer all the time, you would have no idea some of the things we were going through. That is true with every single person on this planet. It is happening with every one of you, whether you want to admit it or not. But when I start to talk about certain public policy things, those are the things I lean on. You know, my dad, once he was divorced, we were living in Arizona, extended himself a little too much. We moved up to Colorado. He was going to be involved in this hotel deal. Ends up that his financial partner maybe wasn't the most honest guys. At least this is the story that I was being told. I remember my dad having to explain to us that he had to file for bankruptcy. That was not something I was prepared for. We lived in beautiful houses, great cars. Next thing you know, we're moving into Meadow Ridge, which is an apartment complex with one bedroom. And I started sleeping on a blow-up mattress in the front room. That's not what I expected. That's not what I thought I was owed. I felt mad. But I very quickly got over it. And I think that was largely my dad. My dad was just, I look at these principles that you all stand for here and what you're trying to do with free enterprise and personal responsibility and liberty. And we were able-bodied Americans. There wasn't some gift or something else that somebody was supposed to hand us to make it happen. We had to get to work. I worked a couple jobs. I'd go wash dishes and turn that money over to my dad. So I've been very blessed to kind of go through those experiences because they make me tougher, stronger, better, give me more perspective. And it's oftentimes those hard things that make you the strong person that you need to be. And so I fast forward to when I, was thinking about my own family and my own life. And it was actually John Huntsman was going to run for governor of Utah. He was the wealthiest family in Utah. I didn't know a soul. I didn't know a thing about him. I really wasn't engaged in politics. But his family had put in hundreds of millions of dollars to fight cancer. And I thought, you know what? If they're going to fight cancer, it took my parents' lives, least I can do is put up a few yard signs. Asked for a 10-minute meeting, turned into a 30-minute meeting, turned into, hey, come back next week. Next thing you know, I was joining the campaign at like a 75% reduction in what I was used to making. He went on, and a few weeks later, he said, hey, congratulations, you're going to be the new campaign manager. And I said, whoa, time out, John. I've never done this before. And he said, oh, don't worry about it. I've never run for governor before. Don't worry about it. He won. He was going to become the 16th governor of Utah, and he said, hey, congratulations, you're going to become the new chief of staff. I said, what, John? It's a $14 billion budget. There's 22,000 employees. I've never done that. He said, oh, don't worry about it. I've never been governor before. It's kind of this philosophy in that book, Good to Great. There's a couple of books that influenced me. Good to Great was one of those, right? Get the right people on the bus and you can figure anything out, right? The other one was a book that it's so old now, I'm embarrassed, but it's not the big that eat the small, it's the fast that eat the slow. That's the name of the book. It's not the big that eat the small, it's the fast that eat the slow. And it was very influential on me. And I got in there and I started learning about things that I never thought I would learn about. Now, I want to tip a hat, if you will, to what you're doing on right for crime and criminal justice reform. Because I can tell you, I didn't give a hoot about this. I didn't know anything about it until I became the chief of staff to the governor. And I did something when I was going to become the chief of staff. I said, Governor, write down for me your top 10 concerns. He wasn't even sworn in yet. What are the 10 things that you're most worried about? And on that list was, I know nothing about the prisons. What happens with executions? What happens if somebody breaks out of the prison? What happens if there's a prison break and suddenly he didn't know any of these things. I didn't know any things. And I had to go dive deep into this. And I had to go figure it out. It was a great experience. And I could give you hours worth of reasoning as to why I love this issue, and I love it for everybody on the whole political spectrum. But hats off to you and what you're doing here on criminal justice reform, because we're talking about real people's lives, and we got big choices and big dollars to make some decisions. And I can't thank you enough for doing that and what you're doing. I really do appreciate it. One of the things that we talked about that I wanted to share with you, that I was asked to sort of address, is this idea of elections. Now, given the structure here of a not-for-profit, I'm not advocating for any particular one, except that we need maximum involvement from everybody. I don't have any problem with that. Making sure that we have a true vote, an accurate count, that there's no voter fraud, that's something we need to address, okay? Let me give you just a statistic to try to illustrate the idea that the world is run by those who show up, those that raise their hands. So few raise their hands, but those that do make the world a difference. In Michigan, where I recently spoke, there are about 5,000 precincts in the entire state of Michigan. How much did Donald Trump win by? 10,000 votes. 2 votes per precinct. Made all the difference. And think about that with your own neighborhood and where you're going and what you're doing. If you want to instill the proper role of government, which personally I believe is very limited, I think our founders were very conservative in their approach. Now, some of the liberals here will disagree with me, but if they wanted a constitutional government that was a glide path for quick change and alteration, they would not have come up with the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives, right? That was not the glide path to passing pieces of legislation as swiftly as they could possibly do it. They put too many powers in place, particularly for senators, but also in the House, to slow the thing down and think about things and make sure that there was a growing, building consensus. That's the way it was supposed to be. That's the way it was originally set up. But as I looked at that spectrum, when I was then, so I worked for the governor, then I left, then I ran for Congress. And that's a whole nother story. But nevertheless, I won. I challenged a 12-year incumbent Republican, and I beat him. I ate one of our own. I said, hey, if you want different results, you're going to have to elect different people. So, it was a winning formula. I spent less than $75,000 to get through the primary, all volunteers, and very blessed that we were able to get to the finish line. But once I got to Congress, I started looking at the very principles and things that I think that you all stand for and work for. I said them a little differently, but I think they're kind of the same as what you had, which was, I said fiscal discipline, limited government accountability, strong national defense. If you get those 4 things right, you're moving the country in the right direction. So, fiscal discipline. Not something I can look you in the eye and tell you we accomplished. I think both parties have been absolute failures on the idea of reining in our financial problems. If you spend $1 million a day, okay, every day, it would take you almost 3,000 years to get to $1 trillion, okay? Our federal government spends more than $1 trillion every 3 months. That's how big that number is. And so when we talk about a debt at $22 trillion, it's a little offensive to me when I hear Nancy Pelosi say the cupboard is bare. We're barely spending what we should be spending. It's going to take everybody with some real political guts on both sides of the aisle to say, we can't do this, folks. You cannot do this. You cannot continue on in perpetuity with those kinds of numbers and expect that we're going to actually leave the world a better place than we have or for our children. Fiscal discipline, limited government. Again, I would still argue Texas can make better decisions. Utah can make better decisions. Well, I was going to say Illinois, but maybe not Illinois, but most every can make much better decisions than the federal government has. I can tell you, as a former member of Congress, we're about 7 miles wide and a ½ inch deep on every issue. There is not an issue that Congress wasn't involved with. That is fundamentally and totally wrong. It's in violation of the principle of the 10th Amendment and something that Texas and others have got to continue to lead the way and say, get out of that business. Focus on what you're supposed to do and let us in the states actually do and administer those things. We have to do that. This was a sweet spot for me, which the next one was fiscal discipline, limited government, accountability. When I got to Congress and I looked at accountability, I thought, how do you actually do that? Like, it sounded good on the stump. It's really good on television, but what does that mean? Like, how do we actually do it? And I would challenge you to think about this in your own state, in your own backyard, your own neighborhood, because there's always somebody doing something stupid somewhere. When you have $4 trillion running out the door from your federal government, when you have I don't know how many tens of billions of dollars being spent here by the state government, there's always somebody doing something wrong, right? So as I sat and looked at that equation, I actually got more excited that I thought I could contribute more to that than I could even these other things. There was a committee that was founded back in 1814 in the United States Congress. It was under a different name then, but it was essentially the Oversight and Government Reform Committee that we know today. And I looked at that committee and I told then our leader Boehner, hey, that's right where I want to be. And he said, well, you're not an attorney, are you? And I said, no. Now, usually I get a standing ovation at this point in the program. But you've been here for 3 days, so I get it. Okay, I understand. He said, well, I want you to be on the Judiciary Committee because we need somebody in there that's not an attorney. And I thought, all right, I buy that. And then he said, okay, oversight. I've never had anybody tell me that oversight was their very first choice. Says a lot about the Congress, right? It's probably why I also it was only the 5th time in 100 years that somebody after 3 terms became a chairman of that committee, and that was me because I was focused on it. I cared about it. Interesting little story that kind of involves this neck of the woods. So they formed this committee in 1814 to look over every government expenditure out of the federal government. As they do so, the committee progressed. In the mid-1800s, there was a young gentleman who was elected to Congress. He joins this committee, and 9 days into being sworn into office, he starts giving speeches because he does not believe the president, who at the time was arguing that the Mexican-American War was justified because the Mexicans had fired shots on Americans and on our territory. And that's why we needed to go to war. Well, this young gentleman came to Congress and said, really? Well, where was that? Because, we haven't heard from anybody who actually witnessed this. Where exactly? What was the spot in which those shots were fired? Well, the president didn't have a good answer, and communication was a little bit different. And so this young congressman started getting on the train and other modes of transportation and followed the president around the country, challenging him where this spot was. And that was his nickname. This young congressman's nickname was Spotty. He was not yet known as Honest Abraham Lincoln. They did not know that Honest Abe was actually calling them, but this is how he initially grew to prominence. And he had a national profile in the one term that he was there, is that Abraham Lincoln just did not believe what the president was saying. Fast forward, September 11th, 2012, there's an attack in Benghazi. I had to look it up. I had no idea where Benghazi was. I was suspect as to whether or not I could even point out Libya on the map and make sure it wasn't Algeria or something. We had, and I could give hours on just this one thing alone. I was the first member of Congress to go over to Libya, but I can tell you, having done so, having sat with the people in Tripoli to listen to their stories and what happened that night, I remember leaving the one day that I was there and getting back on that plane with General Ham and flying back to Stuttgart, Germany, and thinking to myself, nobody ever mentioned a video. Never even brought it up. Never mentioned it. And you know why? Because it was a lie. They made it up. It was a total fiction. Nobody there believed it was a video. Nobody was told they thought it was a video. It was just fiction. Just made it up. They lied to us. The whole apparatus. And it really gave me a lot of resolve that what we were doing was right. And I don't care if it's as big and as weighty as Benghazi, which A lot of people mock me for, oh, yeah, Benghazi, yeah, you know. Well, we did have 4 Americans that were killed. We had lessons from bombings in Africa that we didn't listen to and were, I think it was nearly 300 times they were given waivers to move away from what were called the Inman standards to try to prevent this again from happening. And whether it's this or the Secret Service or the DEA or your public health system, wherever it is, part of the beauty and miracle of the United States of America is this check and balance. And if you really think about it, where does the check and balance happen? Like, how does that happen? It's not just in the formation of the legislation, but it's also in the process that we go through in order to make sure that this separation of powers is unique, it's different. I used to like to say we're different in the United States of America because we are self-critical. We do look in the mirror. We do go back in retrospect, where most countries, most people just glance right over that and just keep going. It is important to look back in the mirror and see what happened and how did that happen. But it's also important that we maintain a semblance of decorum and facts, and there's a whole nother discussion we can have about some of the things that are happening and not happening in Washington here today. It's my plea to you that as you look as the Texas Public Policy Foundation, that you also look to what has happened well and what has not happened well. I went guns a-blazing into the U.S. Marshal, or not the U.S. Marshals, but the Flight Marshal program on how we were putting these agents on airplanes to protect us against another 9/11. Heard about some bad things there. Walked out of there highly impressed and amazed at what our intelligence services do in conjunction with Homeland Security. Even though I'd had all kinds of problems with the TSA, I'm glad we went and looked. You never saw anything in the news, but we spent I don't know how many hours going through that and looking at it. Those types of things have to happen. Last point on the list of 4 is this idea of a strong national defense. Now, Texas probably understands this as well as anybody. Now, I meet Texans up and down, and I've never met a Texan, I think, that isn't committed to the resolve of making sure that the United States military is the biggest, baddest military on the face of the planet. For those of you that have served, have relatives that serve, God bless you and thank you for your service. I've been fortunate as a member of Congress to travel all across the globe. Doesn't matter where on the planet that you go, you're going to find a young man, a young woman, usually in their 20s, serving this nation, putting the stars and stripes on their shoulder, fighting for the United States of America. No matter who the president is, whether it's President Obama, President Trump, they are willing to fight for their country. Probably nothing will get to your heart in a bigger, broader way than meeting some of those that served and were injured. I would wish that every American could go and visit the Walter Reed Medical Center. If you were to go there, you'd find a room. One day I brought about 6 other members of Congress with me, bigger than this room. It's like an Olympic training center. And these were people that had all lost a limb serving their country. Now, women lose limbs too, but the day I was there were about 40 men there that had lost their limbs. And the first guy that I had, first Marine that I got to meet, was a young man from New York. I thought I was prepared when I went into this room, and I wasn't when I went in there, because the very first person that we met, just happened to be him, was in a wheelchair. And he had lost both legs, and he had lost his left arm, and he had lost his right arm. And I didn't know what to do. None of us did. We had tears streaming down our face. You can't shake his hand. I awkwardly tried to give him a hug and say thank you. He was still dazed, and I assume under medication. But I just thought, this person's life will never be the same. But he served our country, and we owe him a lot. And a lot is an understatement. And part of the reason I share this with you is you have people, whether it's the Texas National Guard, the United States military, whatever it might be, who serve, and we recognize them maybe at a dinner but I think the most heartbreaking thing I ever went through is when I met with these Marines. I'd always pull them aside. When we were in Afghanistan, I'd pull them aside and say, hey, I just want you to tell me what it is. And he'd say, permission to speak freely? And it's like, of course, that's what I'm asking you. Just tell me what and you kind of get them to loosen up. And one of these Marines said, sir, the hardest thing for me being deployed is I can't get anybody to help my wife mow the lawn. And it just hurts, and you're just like, you feel embarrassed. As you look at all these policies, the reason I share these kind of emotional, deep-seated stories that I've experienced, when you're going out there and sharing these stories in your belief, you don't spend 3 days, time, money, everything here if you don't truly believe. But my challenge, going back to what I originally said, is to explain to people why you believe what you believe. Share from your heart. Don't be bashful about sharing from your heart why you believe these things. But you know what? The United States of America is still the greatest country on the face of the planet. I went around that room that day and met all of these people that had lost these limbs and got to chat with them. And the last guy, I wish I had kept in contact with him. If you go to my desk at home, very few pictures just of my family. And then Tyrone Woods, who's from Benghazi, I got to know his dad really well. And then another picture of me and this guy named Carlos. Carlos is probably the happiest person I've ever met in my life. He had lost both legs, part of both arms. And he was working with a prosthetic device, and yet he could not have been happier. This kid, I'm telling you, I say kid because I'm feeling old, but this Marine, I think it was on his third tour of duty, got hit by an improvised explosive device. And yet here I am sitting in front of me. It's happened just a couple weeks ago to him. And he is beaming from ear to ear with the biggest smile on his face. And I couldn't figure it out. And I just kept talking to him because I was so just attracted to his optimism and his love of life. And he talked about his wife, he talked about his kids, he talked about his love of God, and it was obvious that he had a foundation that maybe not everybody else in that room had. But what I loved about him was his spirit and his optimism. And it's something that I hope we could instill and share with every American, because we're dealing with tough stuff ourselves. There's always somebody who has it tougher and always somebody that has it easier. Always. But what I really loved about Carlos, which I think captures the American spirit, which really I don't think will ever be broken. We go through tough times, weird times in D.C. and all that. The answers to our problems are not in D.C. They never will be. They're in our own neighborhoods, our own state, our own community, our counties. They're right here at home. What I love about Carlos, though, is the shirt that he was wearing, which I think epitomizes America and just puts a smile on my face every time. His shirt says, "Wounded Combat Marine, some assembly required." I thought, you know what? God bless America. God bless Carlos. Thank you for being part of the solution. Thanks for thinking these things through to find out how we make the world a better place. Because I'm convinced it does make a difference. Most people won't be involved and engaged into it, but that puts the onus and the opportunity on you to help make Texas and make the United States of America the very best country we can possibly be. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Congressman. I owe you, I think, a small apology, or maybe a big one because you're a place kicker. Our general counsel, who is probably better at wisecracks than he is at being an attorney, but did get an award yesterday, observed to me just now that in introducing you, that I said you would hit the upright. And if you're a football fan, you know that's bad. Yeah, okay. I'm a huge football fan, as y'all know, so apologize. You hit it straight through the upright, sir. And by the way, in a very almost mesmerizing and inspirational way. So thanks again for being with us. As we close this entire conference and think about all of the calls to action that we've had, I just want to plead with you to implement whatever has inspired you on Wednesday, on Thursday, today. And I plead with you because, as I mentioned when we opened the conference on Wednesday, I spent a lot of time thinking about crossroads in American history. And I know sometimes I might talk too much about crossroads in American history, but I think it's fitting as we think about what's going on in this country today, in this country this year, that it may not be an overstatement that what happens in 2020, whether in an election or in a policy implementation, but most importantly in our day-to-day interactions with our neighbors and maybe people with whom we disagree, that this is a crossroad in American history. And we have an opportunity as people who wake up each day in Texas to make this the Texas century. And by that I mean a century that honors the sacrifices of people in 1776. It would have been easy at Lexington and Concord for our soldiers supporting the efforts of the Founding Fathers just to go home. We had no business winning the American Revolution, and yet we did. Similarly, we had no business at Washington on the Brazos taking the words and phrases of the American Declaration of Independence and writing them down in the Texas Declaration. We had no business beating Santa Anna. Thank goodness we did. We had no business, after a bloody civil war that killed over 620,000 Americans, ripped apart families, of putting a republic back together. We had no business on the morning after Pearl Harbor, 1941, thinking that, in fact, even a more modern United States of America could withstand that. We had no business telling the Soviet Union in 1989 to tear down that wall. Fittingly, that's the year that this organization was founded, 1989. And what we do every day is charge hills. When people tell us you've got no business doing what you're doing, what we hear is, go. And so if we're going to succeed at this crossroad, then we're going to have to do something new at TPPF. And as a result of some conversations I had this morning, and many of you had, I am very pleased to announce that we're going to be engaged in an effort that I know is crucial to our success, our shared success, regardless of what label you attach to yourself politically. The single most important thing in Texas and the United States of America is the rule of law, period. And I'm an academic think tank guy. I try actively not to engage in hyperbole, so I mean it when I say it. The rule of law, those crossroads, 1776, 1836, 1865, 1941, 1989, those are all in jeopardy if people defraud us this year in elections. And by us, I mean everybody, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Green. And so you're the first people who get to hear the announcement that the Texas Public Policy Foundation has joined that fight to fight voter fraud, and we're going to win that issue. We do not use policy orientation to make fundraising pitches, at least directly. Hopefully, we're more artful than that. You can be the judge of that. And so you know that it is extraordinary for me or any of us in the senior leadership of the foundation to close the conference by asking you to participate in that. Because of the generosity of several people this morning, I was able to commit, and I'm obviously committing publicly, that TPPF will fight voter fraud. We have such generous commitments that we can have an entire task force of an attorney and investigators and hopefully a hotline. And that went so well that we're thinking, well, let's not do this half right. Let's do it completely right. And so I'm going to ask you today, next week, next month, whenever's comfortable, we're not going to twist arms, that if you want to contribute $5 or $55 million to this effort, that you participate. Because if we allow our elections to get stolen, in the same way if we allow our border not to be secure, we fail in our objective to secure liberty. And the whole purpose of securing liberty is so that we can honor the dignity of every single American here, every single person on earth, so that they can flourish here. That's why you get up in the morning. That's why I get up in the morning. And so as you're leaving here today, if you're so inspired, find someone with a TPPF name tag or find me and let us know that you're interested. And you will hear early next week, you will read early next week, the official announcement of this, which sort of ad hoc our board has endorsed today. I will close there with a note of gratitude. And it really is an optimistic one. We're going to win that issue. We're going to win every other issue that we've talked about today. Some may take a few days, some may take a few decades. But the most important reason that we're going to do so is because we wake up every day in gratitude, and that gratitude inspires us to dig a little bit deeper, literally and figuratively. And it means that when there is a hill to charge, and at the top of that hill is the Texas flag and the American flag, we will charge it every single time. God bless you, and God bless America.